Father, we thank you for this time. We thank you that we can, through technology, share your word in times like this. And specifically today, Lord, we ask and thank you for the news that we are apparently over the peak this time, and we are now looking in talk of an exit plan. We ask that you grant wisdom to those people that are making those decisions. We ask, Lord, that you help us to accept whatever happens gracefully and pure guidance and pure wisdom. And we thank you once again for this opportunity to hear and share your word in your name. Amen.
Amen.
Matthew 5:13-19 tells us, "You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to the Father in heaven." There's a lot of verses in the Bible that I've heard lots of teaching on, and each one tends to be similar to the past. And whilst I don't profess to be the kind of teacher in the vein of some of the great teachers I've listened to and observed, I do at times look for depth and guidelines on the application of some of these verses into our everyday lives. And this is the case in Matthew 5. We know that salt adds flavour, light illuminates the way. All I want to know is how that equates to my life and my day-to-day existence. An amazing thing I find in some of the Bible is some of the things that Christ teaches, some of the things that God says in the Old Testament. Science shows us that these things had relevance long before we knew some of these facts. And this is the case with salt. Many references to salt tend to bring to the fore the images of salt that we find on our dinner table and we put on our food. Unfortunately, these images of salt are already untrue, because that salt, even the stuff that we might get in the grinder, has generally had stuff added to it to aid the way it breaks down into those fine particles. You see, salt is very stable. Dry stored, it cannot be destroyed. It cannot decay without something else being added to it. Understanding then the source of salt in its base form is the result of water erosion of volcanic rock. It doesn't evaporate. Rock salt in places like Salt Lake City come about in the same way. It would take a scientist to explain this accurately. Most of us are aware of the various ways that salt has been used over the years to preserve food, to add and enhance flavour, to cleanse, to anaesthetise, as currency, and to dissolve and thaw in ice. In true teaching style, I'm just going to look at each of these briefly. Salt preserves food by drawing the moisture out of it. That moisture is essential for the growth of microorganisms and bacteria. The word salad actually comes from the Latin for salted vegetables. Salt itself does not actually change the flavour of food. What it does is to change the way that the consumer is able to taste that food by affecting the receptors in the mouth. Salt used as currency, and it was used in the ancient world up until around 1800. It's not a rare product, is it? It's available in abundance, but it takes graft to isolate it and the law to control it, to put the value on it. And surprising as it may seem, salt spreading to pour ice and to improve traction is not a new thing either. Probably less surprising though is the fact that you will be advised to raid the council salt chain supplies if you need some more salt for your dinner. Because there's the matter of legality, but there's also the fact that that salt is damaged because it's been mixed with gravel and sand to make it effective. When Jesus spoke about unsalted salt being fit only for trampling underfoot, he was talking about it in exactly the same context that it is used today. It's all right. It was used back then for the same reason. How about light? Light is interesting, and it's a very understated teaching on this. It's more than simply being a beacon of righteous living, but we'll get onto that later. What we need to know is that light can destroy darkness, but darkness cannot destroy light. Light will always be darkness, because darkness is only the absence of light. To exist though, light also needs ignition, it also needs heat. The sun gives the light and the heat, but God ignited it. Light will illuminate darkness and expose what there is. As with salt, both need friction to create the heat, to create the process, to create salt, to create light. Light warms, light illuminates, salt preserves, cleanses and enhances. So let's just look at that friction for a minute. Salt cannot be created without friction. When Christ calls us the salt, he is telling us that we have gone through and will continue going through that process that makes us salt. Our salvation is a conscious process. For some of us it may happen quickly, and for others it may take years. The truth is that whilst Christ calls us, we still have to make a choice. We may have done some superficially good living, good life abiding by Christian values, and even attended church twice on a Sunday and the odd midweek meeting. But to become a Christian, we had to make that choice. We had to realise it wasn't enough. We had to give our lives and our bodies up to Christ so that he could use them for his glory. Whatever our life before we made that choice, there was friction. We may have reached rock bottom, we may have just made the choice before we cried out to Jesus to take control and turn our lives around. Whatever our journey, Christ was already at work, creating that friction that would turn us into the salt and what he intended for our lives to be. Joel 2 verse 2 tells us that he restores the years that have been eaten away. In his letter to the Romans, Paul states that all things work for the good for those who love the Lord. The shopping out here is that includes the bad stuff as well. The bad stuff that happened before we were Christians has been turned around for the good and for the glory of Christ. Our past life and the will of God created salt in us. People will talk of their wasted years and their past failures, but that was the friction that grated and ground us, creating us into salt. The battles taking place in us before we were saved. The friction between what we were created to be and what we were trying to be in the flesh. Understand, these battles don't stop when we're saved. And that's why we're instructed in Romans 2:2 not to be conformed to the world, but transformed by the daily renewing of our mind. That friction exists again between being conformed to the world and transformed into the image of Christ. We have to do it daily, and we have to then use that salt as Christ instructs. Jesus says we are salt and we are light. He does not make it an optional extra. To be a Christian is to be salt and is to be light. And that work began a long time ago before we realised it was going on. If you were a Christian, you need to consider at some point, somewhere, someone is praying for your life, your fruit to come to fruition in somebody else's life. Paul may indeed have had the original Damascus Road conversion, but look at what he went through and what happened in that. He was thrown off his high horse. He was blinded by the light. He went through further processes before the scales fell from his eyes. It was a time of losing his status, of trials and testing. We all have to go through this process over and over again as we create more salt, more light to replace the salt and light that we deliver and burn for the glory of Christ. So let's look at the salt. Let's look at how we put that into practice. Let's preserve. If we are salt, then we will be in the business of preserving. It's not about doing a first aid course or joining a campaign group. That may or may not be good and worthy. but we're talking about spiritual health here. The process that salt uses to preserve is that it draws out moisture. In doing that, it deprives bacteria and poisons of their life source. Being salt is not simply the act, though, of being such a glowing example of purity and righteousness that everyone wants to be like us. It involves an act that draws out the life source of the poison and the dirt in others, the stuff that adversely affects them spiritually. It's not about cleansing, which we'll come to later, but it's about pulling out that life source of the stuff that seeks to destroy and kill others spiritually. If we are salt, and salt is created by friction, then we will see how our own battles, our own friction, our own erosion is the very tool with which we can see stuff in others and do the right thing about it. If rejection is the poison that kills, then absolutely deliverance and healing works. Jesus calls for us though to be salt, and we can be part of that healing process. Through our own friction, the stuff that we learn in our own struggles, we learn empathy, we learn understanding. We know how to show Christ off to others, and in doing so, we deprive that spirit of rejection its life force. Likewise, the salt in others will deprive the poison of spirits in our lives if we allow them to minister to us. Salt used is cleansing and healing. Their salt preserves by drawing out the foods and life sources of dangerous poisons. There's more to learn. Salt can assist in cleansing and healing that we're all in need of. And that process is very much the same, that it delves a little deeper. In preserving, we see how salt pulls out the moisture. In cleansing and healing, it does the same, pulling out the dirt and the stuff that shouldn't be there in the same process. But it's been put there and it's been able to grow by the hurt and the damage. There is a type of person who enjoys the cleansing. They seem to get satisfaction from drawing attention to the wrongdoing. But that is not cleansing, that is not healing, that is destruction, that is killing. The soul has become born out of the old-fashioned school of hard knocks. We are the soul. That is formed in those battles which I keep coming back to. Our means of being salt to others has been formed through this, and it gives us that ability to discern. My salvation was instant, but it was not my final destination. I endured battles during which I repeatedly hated church, not Christ, but I did hate church, and I returned to my old way of life. I find that failed to satisfy, so I'd give church another go, and I'd fall out with people, and I'd feel this, and I'd feel that, and I'd go back to my old life. For 2 years, I jumped from one to the other. It was the salty people that kept pulling me back. Their own journeys had been the same struggle. When I complained, they knew where it was coming from. They knew how to break it through their own battles. When I pined for the past exhilaration, for the risk of taking of my old life, they got it. Their lives, their experiences had not been the same as mine, but they had enough salt to know what they and me were talking about. Others may have said, don't go there, because they knew it was wrong, but these people could say, I know why you want to go there, and I know why that doesn't work. Let me help you find another way. Salt that cleanses and heals doesn't merely identify the dirt, the bacteria, the pathogens. It helps to remove them. The more we allow Christ to do his work through us, the more he can cleanse, the more he can heal. We can allow him to deep clean us, then so that the poison cannot return. Putting it simply, we don't just say to others, don't do that, stop doing that. We say, let me help. We say, let me walk beside you, let me stand by you as you say so. Your battles are common to all. How about salt as an asset, as something of value? It's incredible to think that something as common as salt was once considered valuable. After all, gold, silver, diamonds, they're valuable because they're rare. But it's not actually that strange, is it? Our actual money these days is made out of common elements. It's manufacturing and production that makes the currency valuable, just as it was with salt. Within us as Christians, salt should be commonplace and precious too. Our ability, our capacity to preserve, to cleanse and to heal should be overflowing, affecting every aspect of our behaviour and every interaction that we have with others. We don't need to put some aside though. We don't need to open a savings account because Christ is constantly topping us up. We need our salt to be governed and to come under the control of Christ in our lives, as we will see. We get this bit as well about salt adding flavour. Now, I don't put a lot of salt in my food, not because I'm concerned about the health side of it, it's just something I've never done. But I understand when I watch cookery shows, they're constantly going on about adding seasoning, adding salt. Salt does something amazing. It doesn't affect the food and it doesn't change it in any way. The salt's effect on the consumer. It works on the taste buds. The preserving and cleansing has been done, or the food's been done before. We've got more salt in it. Once the food is on our plates, though, then we need scientists to explain again how it works. But when it goes into our mouth, it affects our taste buds. You might ask how this relates to our earthly relationships. Salt works to emphasise the flavour. The food we put in our mouth remains unchanged. It is still a piece of potato soaked in oil and fried. Nothing has changed. But the salt on it stimulates the ability for the consumer to appreciate it. Perhaps if I go through a couple of verses, we'll get an even bigger idea of this. Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger. Whoever believes in me shall not thirst. Paul writes in the letter to Hebrews, for though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the basic principles of the oracles of God. You need milk, not solid food. For everyone who lives on milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, since he is a child. Solid food is for the mature, for those who have the powers of discernment, trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. In Corinthians, I've fed you with milk, not solid food, for you were not ready for it. And even now you are not ready, for you still of the flesh. For while there is strife among you, are you not of the flesh, and behave only in the human mind? So, Christ is the bread of life, the gospel is described as milk or meat, and we are the salt. He says, you are the salt. As salt, we don't change the construction of the content of the gospel. We don't change Jesus Christ. Our role is to enhance the ability of others to receive it. It's not about covering up difficult parts and pretending they don't exist or standing a lie. It's about sharing the gospel in a way specific for the person. Salt assists an individual's ability to taste what is there, so that we too should be in that position to assist others in being able to draw out the flavour of the gospel according to the way that God has created them. Salt enhances the sweet, the sour, the bitter, and the hot and the cold. It doesn't discriminate. It stimulates the taste buds to seek those flavours. Are we willing to do the same with the Word of God? Are we willing to help people to see and taste the full scope of the gospel and to understand it?
That's good.
Now, over the years, we've learned a lot about too much salt in food. Surely this can't be the case here, but it is. Too much salt is dangerous. Go back to what we just said. We are the salt. The gospel is for me. Christ is the bread. Is it possible to have too much salt? Absolutely it is. It's an area we have to be careful. We don't not to confuse tact, common sense and compromise. We must never compromise the gospel. We don't soak the food in water before adding salt. Salt is to enhance what is already there. If there's too much of us and not enough of Christ and not enough of the gospel, it's too much salt. So absolutely, yes. When Jesus said we're salt, we might think we're being clever and saying, oh, well, you can have too much salt. Yes, you can. How about losing our saltiness? It's intriguing. Jesus does not say you will become salt. He does not say you will become salt. He says you are the salt. We're not like salt, we are salt. Do you know what unsalty salt is called? There's no such thing. It's just not salt anymore. Salt has to be changed into something else before it loses its saltiness. As I said before, kept dry and free from additives, it remains salty. To lose its saltiness, it needs to have moisture in particular added. That's something that will change its makeup. And that might sound confusing, considering it's been formed by water, but the water has to be removed to make it salt. There we go again, the friction, the erosion the water created. That might have created us, that might have changed us and transformed, but then it has to be removed once we become salt. But we have to be careful again. Salt kept in a jar with a lid on it remains salt, but it doesn't serve a purpose if it stays stuck in a jar with a lid on it. It has to have something. When you take that lid off, it's opened up to all sorts of contaminants and other things to add to it. Moisture, bugs and dust. If the container, and that's us, is left open, the dust in the air flies around and settles on the jar. If the jar's open, it remains, if the jar's sealed, it remains protected. If the jar is open, if we are open, then the dust comes in and affects the salt. What's dust? 90% human skin, 10% scrapings and other waste products carried through the air. Every time someone coughs or sneezes, as we keep hearing, they expel stuff from their body, they release germs, they release fluids and pathogens into the air, and these will settle somewhere, and that will include our open food containers. If we leave our salt container ourselves unprotected, the same thing happens. The flesh, the germs of the world get intermingled with our salt, and they contaminate it, they can compromise it. It becomes polluted and dangerous. It's worthless to be discarded before it can be purified. Bugs. Make no mistake about it, ants, mosquitoes, flies are created by God and they have a purpose. Unfortunately, that purpose is not to be close to food. If you look at the fly that breaks down rotten food and waste, it has a purpose. If it gets into the jar that is us, it affects the salt, the unprotected salt. It brings that dirt and that waste from the world into us. They chew, they regurgitate salt, they die from it and they rot in the jar. The stuff in the world will do the same to us if we left unguarded and unprotected. The attitudes, the behaviours of the world will affect us. They will come into our being and leave dirt on our salt. We used rejection before, we talked about. We may take rejection of the gospel as rejection of ourselves if we've allowed the things of the world to get in. And we stop being salt, we become angry, bitter people. The bugs walk over our salt. If this sounds far-fetched, remember, in the Old Testament we talked about Joel, we referred to the cankerworm and the locust. In Matthew 6:19, Jesus talks about the moths eating our treasure on earth. If our soul is left unguarded, the same is true. Worms, locusts, moths that represent the world get in and rot away our soul. Moisture will destroy salt. Between 1 and 4% of the atmosphere is water, depending on the temperature. If we take our kitchen though, that moisture increases when we boil kettle, boil vegetables. When we talk about the stuff of the flesh, we have our own sweat, our own exhalation. All moisture cools down and settles. Our unprotected salt jar is left uncovered. Moisture comes in, it changes the compound that was once salt. The bugs and the dust pollute the salt, make it lethal. Moisture dilutes it, totally changes it into something else. Unguarded salt in us will have the same result. We will water down our the teachings. We will water down the gospel. Our salt is diluted. It's no longer salt. An example, Jesus tells us, judge not lest you be judged. In a world that is inundated, we talk about being non-judgmental, which incidentally is not taught by people who've got such a chip on their shoulder as to be the most judgmental people you will come across. When we look to Jesus, we set him on as our standard. We cannot take delight in our own righteousness, our own standards of behaviour. We cannot pass judgment on the behaviour of others. When I see another person, Christian or otherwise, acting in a way I disagree with, I can raise it with them, but I have no right to question their salvation or to pass an opinion on their spiritual condition or consider myself to have the moral high ground. Prejudice and judgment come from the same root, prejudging, which is common practice in the world. When we let the moisture of the world come into our soul supply, it dilutes it, it destroys it. When we try and put Christ's instructions alongside worldly interpretation of being non-judgmental, we get two conflicting ideas and only one can be true. When it comes to anger, lust for power, lust for sex, lust for wealth, lust for recognition, lust for praise, and unforgiveness, they're all open to the moisture of the world to corrupt them. If we try to speak of Christ while the moisture of the world has corrupted our soul, we lose the ability, we lose the right to share. Have you watched somebody who has the moisture of the world affecting their speech? It's sad and painful to watch. The soul has no value. It can only be thrown on the ground, trodden underfoot. So just to recap on that then, dust comes in, contaminates the saltiness. The bugs regurgitate, rot in it. The moisture destroys the soul. When we leave ourselves unprotected, when we leave ourselves unguarded, and that is so relevant at the moment, to make sure that we keep sharing, we keep communicating with one another. Because whilst we can call on God, we can put the armour on, the armour of God on, we need the fellowship, we need to maintain it. That's a biblical instruction. That will help us to be guarded, that will help us to guard that soulness. When we lose that, it says it's fit to be broken on the ground. Soul spreading is not a new thing. Christ is talking about it in the same way as it is used today. But as I was studying this, it just occurred to me that we shouldn't write off those who have lost their saltiness, because there's still a use when he says it's to be thrown on the ground. It still has a purpose. But you take the salt jar, which is you, which is me, you empty the contaminated salt on the ground. It has a purpose. But more than that, you can clean the jar and you can fill it again with fresh salt. So let's just bear that in mind and not lose sight of that. I'm not going to speak too much on the light at the moment. What I think we need to understand with this is Jesus says, you are the light to the world. He is the light of the world. When Christ comes into us, we need to reflect his glory. We need to reflect him. We need to understand that whilst we are a light, our deeds, our actions should always be lights that illuminate the path to him and not to our own doing. We should not hide the gospel. We should not hide the truth. We should be an example. But people shouldn't be looking and saying necessarily, I want to be like you. That's good if it's reflecting Christ, because you should be able to tell them, yeah, you want to be like Christ in me, not me. And that is so important, because we can see this thing as the light as being about look to me, but it's not. If you look at a light in the living room or a street light, it will blind you, but it illuminates what's around it. And that's where we should be, is illuminating Christ, illuminating the gospel. And I'm going to leave you, where should we go with this? St. Francis is credited with saying, preach the gospel at all times and use words when necessary. And it's a good code to live by if we understand it in its proper context. We should be an example. Our lives should be preaching the gospel. And then we have to use words because they're necessary to explain the hope that is within us, to explain what it is that makes us where we are. I recall a man who used to speak and evangelise in the town where I lived. He was mocked and he was ridiculed mercilessly as he stood there sharing the gospel. It was a time in the 80s, and his presence was a cause of furore. It was always incredible to think that in that town centre, people of all political persuasions were peddling their politics and their extreme views, and to be perfectly frank, very offensive views. And nobody was bothered, but when this man stood to preach the gospel, he was ridiculed, and he was abused verbally and threatened. I'm sad to say I was one of those who used to do that. From time to time, because of the trouble that surrounded him, the police would be called, and on one occasion, having been told to stop sharing the gospel, he was arrested, and the court served an injunction which said he was not to preach the gospel in that town centre. A few months after that, he came back. He recognised our crowd that used to gather around there. This time, he actually came and sat down and talked to us. He shared what had happened after his arrest. He was given this injunction, and that actually served to create a connection with our own little group. But more than that, it was the fact that he came and sat with us and that he talked face to face. We stopped shouting abuse to him, we stopped mocking him, and we noticed that he was receiving a lot less from other people passing by too. Now, I don't pretend that he had a major impact on me, but I do know that not long afterwards one of our group disappeared, and the next time I saw her, she was raving about Jesus and trying to get me to listen to his songs of fellowship, which I refused. His words previously had lacked song, but then there had been no light in his actions. When he demonstrated light and song, he had an impact. I'm aware of the young lady I mentioned there soon removed herself from our social group, but not after taking a few others with her, and she went on to join a missions group working abroad. By coming and simply sitting down and talking, it had been enough light to have an impact, enough song to have an impact. I don't know what effect he had on the others, or the influence of our others around the world in the last 35 years. But I am aware that he went from being an empty vessel, preaching the word, to becoming salt and light, and that had an effect. Another time, a few of us went to a Christian drop-in cafe that used to open on a Friday and Saturday night, and despite the fact that we were all very drunk and intending this activity, people came and spoke and spent time with us. They didn't throw us out, they didn't run scared. They simply gave a bit of time to 8 rowdy teenagers who wanted to wind them up and disrupt what we consider to be their coded little group. Nothing spectacular, nothing high profile, just being salt, just being light at that particular time. Salt and light are not random words, they're not random synonyms. It's amazing, as I say, how these research from 2,000 years later shows these words are so accurate. They serve to make them more and more relevant. Whether Christ is speaking of eagle's wings, which we now know never suffer fatigue, or camels and needles, or broods of vipers, or whitewashed tombs full of dead men's bones, the words he uses only make the point clearer the more that we learn. Salt and light, cleansing, preserving, healing, acting to help people to receive the full gospel more clearly, lighten the path to Christ. We can all do that. Our lives can become a witness and a testimony. We can show people the beauty, the majesty, the grace, and magnificence of Jesus Christ. And just taking this whole idea of the song and how it works, and see how we can use the friction of our past life to draw out the food, the life source of the evil that seeks to take over people's lives, to cleanse, to prepare them, is amazing. I'm just going to finish with quoting the Christian artist McRae. I'm not going to use speak as he speaks because it would just sound weird. We are saved through faith, not works. Nothing you can do, nothing that I can do, can get us this great salvation that we have It's only Christ. If you feel you need to clean yourself up before you can come to Him to get it, just come to Him and He will change you from the inside out. Thank you.